Hello, today I'm going to tell you about the people who have a whole life tariff. In the UK, a prison sentence, or a life sentence rather, is 25 years with the chance of parole. But a whole life tariff is a lot more different, very hard to get, and it means you'll never be released from prison. It's reserved for the worst criminals only. And today I'll tell you about all the people who've been given a whole life tariff. And spoiler alert, it's not that many. Thank you.
First on the list is OG crazy man Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper. He's serving a whole life sentence for the murders of 13 women in Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. During the 1970s, he managed to evade the police for many years due to plenty of blunders, police incompetence and blatant cover-ups. When he's eventually caught in the 1980s, he was given a whole life tariff. He recently died in prison of COVID-19. Myra, Hinley and Ian Brady went on a killing spree during the 1960s, killing children and teenagers, torturing and sexually assaulting them before burying the bodies on Sadala Moor, just to the west of Manchester. Both are dead now. Brady died aged 79 in 2017 and Hinley died in 2002 at the age of 60, both in prison. Next up is Harold Shipman, Dr. Death he was known as, jailed in January 2000 for murdering 15 patients while working in Hyde, Greater Manchester. The official predictions were that he killed around 215 to 260 people over a 23-year period. Shipman murdered his victims with injections of diamorphine, the clinical name for heroin, after stockpiling vast amounts of the drug falsely prescribed it as a painkiller to dying patients. GP would usually call on mainly elderly victims in their home on a pretext and give them a deadly injection. He hung himself in Wakefield prison. Levi Bellfield is unique in this case because he's the only serial killer in the UK to be handed 2 whole life orders. He was jailed in 2008 for 2 murders, 22-year-old Amelie Delagrange in 2004 and the 2003 murder of Marcia MacDonald, aged 19, after the 2 were linked by police. 3 years later he was convicted of murdering 13-year-old Millie Dowler in 2002. She was snatched from the street while walking on her way home from school in the fancy area of Walton-on-Thames. The body was found in local woods 6 months later. He's currently on prison on 2 life orders. Rosemary West, the next female on the list. Her and her husband Fred tortured, raped and murdered an unknown number of women between 1967 and 1987, mostly in their Gloucester home, which became known as the House of Horrors. Police found 9 sets of bones under the patio and cellar of the house. Husband Fred West, a builder, killed himself while waiting trial the murder of 12 women, leaving Rosemary West to serve out her whole life tariff in Newhall Prison, Flockton, West Yorkshire. Fusilier Lee Rigby was brutally murdered on the streets of Woolwich, South East London in May 2013. Recent Muslim converts Michael Adebolawe and Michael Abdelajo ran over the 25-year-old soldier close to the barracks before stabbing him to death in broad daylight. The father of one died as a result of multiple cuts and stab wounds after the attack, fueled by Abdelawe and Abdelawajo's extremist beliefs, described as a betrayal of Islam at their murder trial in 2014. Abdelajo was sentenced to a whole life term, while Abdelawe received a 45-year minimum term. John Strafing spent 55 years behind bars until his death in prison in 2007. Strafing killed 2 young girls in the summer of 1951, and when he appeared in court he was found unfit to plead and was committed to Broadmoor Hospital. He escaped the facility in 1952 and killed 5-year-old Lydia Bowyer during the few hours he was let out. Strafing was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but was later handed a whole life sentence instead due to his mental state. Next on the list is piece of crap Dale Creegan, cowardly killing 2 unarmed and innocent female police officers who turned up to reports of a burglary. He hit them with a grenade and gunfire, killing them both at the scene. He was already on the run for the killing of Mark and David Short, a father and son gangster team in the Droylsden area of Manchester. Trevor Hardy, who murdered 3 teenage girls between December 74 and March 76, was nicknamed the Beast of Manchester. Janet Stewart, 15, was stabbed to death and buried in a shallow grave, and Wanda Sakala, 17, was hit with a brick and sexually assaulted in Moston while walking home from work. And Sharon Moss, who was strangled by a pair of tights before her body was dumped in the canal. During his trial, he attempted to confess to manslaughter. However, his plea was rejected and he was given 3 counts of murder, and he remained in prison until his death 36 years later, by which time he was one of the longest serving prisoners in the UK. Dennis Nielsen, known as the Muswell Hill murderer, killed boys and young men who he lured into his flat between 1978 and 1983. He would befriend the men, who were often homeless or vulnerable, offering them food and lodgings that evening back in his North London flat. When DCI Peter J was called there on February 9, 1983 to investigate human fragments of flesh and bone clogging the drains, police realised they had a serial killer on their hands. Nilsson was convicted at the Old Bailey of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. Only 8 of his victims were ever named, and even to this day, not all the bodies have been recovered. Nilsson died in prison, aged 72, in May 2018. Steve Wright was dubbed the Suffolk Strangler or Ipswich Ripper for his crimes. He is serving life imprisonment for murdering a total of 5 women who worked in the sex trade during the later months of 2006. Forensic evidence led to his arrest in December after tiny flecks of blood were found on the back seat of his Ford Mondeo. He was found guilty of all 5 murders in 2008 and handed a whole life sentence. Thomas Mayer killed Labour MP Joe Cox. He stabbed her 15 times and shot her 3 times outside her constituency surgery in Birstall near Leeds a week before the EU referendum. Neo-Nazi Thomas Bear, who shouted Britain first in the attack, was given a whole life sentence for the murder. In November 2016, Mayer was found guilty of several charges, including the murder of Cox, the stabbing of Bernard Kenny, a bystander who tried to help the MP, possession of a firearm with the intent to commit an indictable offence, and the possession of an offensive weapon. He will never be released from prison. Salford hitman Mark Fellows, known as the Iceman, was responsible for the murders of John Kinsella and Paul Massey. Massey, 55, who was branded Salford's Mr. Big, was murdered by Fellows outside his own home. Judge Mr. William Davis sentenced him to a whole life term following the murder trial. He was later handed another life sentence after the jury found him guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm with intent for his involvement in a brutal knife attack of Aaron Williams, another associate of Paul Massey, who will never be released from prison. Stephen Griffiths was nicknamed the Crossbow Cannibal. He was convicted of murdering 3 sex workers in Bradford, including one who he killed with a crossbow. He dismembered his victims before dumping the remains in the River Aire. The killer claimed to have eaten parts of the victims, though this was never definitely proven. He was given a whole life tariff for his crimes. Reading terror attacker Kari Sadala murdered 3 men in a park in a brutal knife attack last year. The 26-year-old was heard shouting Allahu Akbar as he fatally stabbed friends James Furlong, Dr. David Wallace and Joseph Ritchie Bennett. 3 other people, Stephen Young, Patrick Edwards and Nishit Nusadan, were also injured before Salah threw away the 8-inch knife and ran off, pursued by an off-duty police officer. Sadala of Reading pleaded guilty to 3 murders and 3 attempted murders. Mr. Justice Sweeney sentenced him at the Old Bailey to a whole life order, saying it was a rare and exceptional case. As you can see, the list is short, and the crimes people have had to commit to get these sentences are absolutely terrible. But it's good to know that these people will never walk the streets again.